Hi, everybody. I'm so glad you decided to join us for another study into the book of Philippians. Last time we talked about how Paul had these really strong convictions and how he said, for me to live is Christ, but to die is gain. And we saw how conflicted he was in all of that. Well, he gets done talking about what he's been going through and kind of his mindset. And in verse 27, which is where we're going to pick up right now, we find out what his wish is and what he's talking about for the Philippians. He says this: only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened in anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. Engage in the same conflict that you saw I had, and now hear that I still have. Paul here is going to go, and he's kind of presenting three things here that the Philippian church was experiencing or going to experience, what he wanted from them. And the first one of them we find in verse 27. He wants them to stand firmly united. And you may be saying, Pastor, that doesn't sound that great. But look at what Paul says here. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Literally, he's talking here, if you were to restructure this, it would be live as citizens of the gospel. Live as citizens of the gospel. And here's how we do that: by standing, that I may hear that you are standing firm in one spirit with one mind. Paul here is talking about, hey, I want you guys to be standing firm in your faith for Jesus Christ, living as citizens of the gospel. And do so in a way that shows the unity that you have within the body of Jesus, but also you're standing firm, you're digging your heels in, and you're ready to go. That idea here at the end of the verse, it says, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. It has the idea almost of a team sport. So he's like, stand firmly united, continuing to promote the gospel together, arm in arm, hand in hand, as you go forward. Philippi, after all, was a Roman colony. And as a Roman colony, they would have appreciated him saying, live as a citizen of the gospel. Live your life as a citizen worthy of the gospel. The second thing we find out is to have no fear of your opponents. No fear of your opponents. Verse 28. And not frightened in anything by your opponents. Paul was telling them that they're going to go up against people who are going to not promote the gospel, or if anything, maybe even persecute them because they were of the gospel. Paul would know this better than anybody, having been on both sides of the coin, the persecuted and also the persecutor. And he says, don't worry about them. They should not be frightened in any way by who they were going against. After all, he says this is a clear sign to them of their destruction. He's like, by you standing firm, by you not having any fear, it points out to them that there's coming a day when they will be judged for not accepting Jesus. But it also, he says, is going to show how you are going to be saved, how you have been saved, and how in the future you will be taken to be with God. Stand firm, having no fear against your opponents for the gospel. And then the last thing here is that we find in verses 29 and 30. For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ, you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. Paul says here in this verse, hey, see suffering as a privilege. See the privilege of suffering. Here in verse 29, it says that word grant. Literally, when you go back into the Greek words of all of that, and you get to the crux of the matter, the same root word that we get the word grace or favor from is the same root word as the Greek is for this verse and the word grant. He says, hey, see your suffering as a gracious act of God. I think of the apostles when they were persecuted in the early church and how they said they counted it all joy because they would be able to suffer for the gospel. They would be able to suffer for Jesus. They counted it as an honor. So many times you and I, we don't see it that way. We don't see suffering as a privilege. We see suffering as a pain. But yet suffering is a privilege when we're suffering for the gospel of Jesus Christ. And then in verse 30, Paul here is literally just saying, engage in the same conflict that you saw I had and now still here that I still have. Paul's trying to encourage them the same way that they had encouraged him in his persecution. Guys, here's the fact of the matter. We need to be, as a church, we need to be as Christians, standing firm, united, living our life as citizens worthy of the gospel. Having no fear of who comes up against us, because suffering is a privilege. Suffering for the sake of the gospel is a privilege. And I don't know where you're at with all of this, but what's God trying to tell you today? What area do you need to work on? Because that's where we got to say, okay, God, allow me to see what you would have for me from your word. I hope that you guys have a great rest of the day, and I hope that you spend some time thinking about what God would have you work on as you live the Christian life, this joy-filled Christian life, as we continue to learn from the book of Philippians. I hope to see you again in another video again real soon. Bye-bye, guys.